This wasn't supposed to happen. In 2026, something doesn't add up. Americans aren't chasing diamonds the way they used to. They're chasing color. Neon blues, electric greens, deep violet flashes. Stones most people couldn't even name a few years ago are suddenly everywhere. Some of them come from a single place on Earth. Some of them change under light, and one of them is being bought faster than it can even be mined. So what changed? Because this isn't just a trend, it's a shift in how people choose what to wear, what to invest in, and what they believe is actually valuable. Today we're breaking down the 10 jewel-tone gemstones quietly taking over America in 2026. Not by price, not by rarity alone, but by something far more unpredictable. Why people suddenly can't ignore them. Ranked 10th, chrome diopside. The gem that looks too expensive to be this cheap. There's a moment in every market shift when something looks too good to ignore and just unfamiliar enough to be overlooked. That moment is exactly where chrome diopside sits in 2026. At a glance, it delivers a visual punch that feels almost out of place for its price. Deep, saturated green, clean enough to rival stones that traditionally sit far higher on the value ladder. But this isn't emerald. It doesn't carry the same legacy, the same branding, or the same expectations. And that difference, once a disadvantage, is now becoming its greatest advantage. Because American buyers are changing. Quietly, but decisively. The focus is shifting away from inherited prestige and toward something far more immediate. Impact. What does it look like in natural light? How does it feel in motion? Does it stand out without explanation? Chrome diopside answers all three, instantly, and yet the price hasn't caught up. That gap between how it looks and what it cost is where curiosity begins to build. For a growing segment of buyers, especially those who have already experienced traditional gemstones, that gap doesn't signal risk. It signals opportunity. There's also a psychological layer driving this shift. In a market saturated with overexposed classics, discovering something that feels ahead of the curve carries its own form of status. Not inherited status, but discovered status. The kind that feels personal, intentional, and slightly contrarian. Chrome diopside fits that narrative perfectly. It doesn't try to compete with legacy stones. It sidesteps them. And in doing so, it taps into a different kind of desire, one that's less about proving value to others and more about recognizing it before everyone else does. That's what makes its rise in 2026 so interesting. Not because it's the rarest stone on this list, not because it's the most expensive, but because it challenges a deeper assumption. That visual intensity should always come at a premium. For now, that assumption is breaking. Quietly but unmistakably, and when perception shifts before pricing does, attention tends to follow. Ranked 9th. Rhodolite. Not every gemstone demands attention. Some earn it slowly, by refusing to look like anything else. Rhodolite exists in a color space that feels almost unresolved. Neither fully red nor completely purple, it settles into a range that shifts depending on light, setting, and even expectation. That ambiguity used to work against it. In a market built on clear definitions, ruby, sapphire, emerald, anything in between often struggled to find its place. That's no longer the case. In 2026, a different kind of buyer is shaping demand across the United States. Not one driven purely by hierarchy or traditional value systems, but by something more internal. Connection. The question is no longer what is this stone supposed to be, but how does it feel to wear it? Rhodolite answers that question in a way few gemstones can. Its tones, often described as raspberry, wine, or rose with depth, don't announce themselves with intensity alone. Instead, they invite a second look and then a third. Under warmer light, it leans richer, more intimate. In cooler conditions, it sharpens, revealing subtle violet undertones that shift just enough to remain unpredictable. That sense of movement, even without dramatic optical phenomena, is part of its appeal. It doesn't perform, it resonates. There's also a broader cultural shift reinforcing its rise. Across jewelry trends, particularly among American buyers in the 35 to 65 range, there's a visible move away from standardized perfection. Stones that feel too precise, too expected, are losing ground to those that carry nuance, stones that feel chosen, not assigned. Rhodolite fits seamlessly into that transition. It doesn't compete with ruby on legacy, nor with sapphire on structure. It operates outside those comparisons entirely. And in doing so, it offers something increasingly valuable: individuality without explanation. Retailers have begun to notice the pattern. Pieces featuring rhodolite aren't always the most expensive in the case, but they are often the ones people return to. Not because they were told to, but because something about the color stayed with them longer than expected. And that lingering effect is difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. In a market where attention is often immediate and short-lived, rhodolite creates a different kind of impact. One that builds quietly, then holds. Not through dominance, but through memory. Ranked 8th, blue zircon. For years, this stone has been dismissed before it was ever truly seen. The name alone has worked against it. Zircon has long been confused with something synthetic, something disposable, something meant to imitate rather than exist on its own terms. That assumption settled in quietly and stayed there. But natural blue zircon tells a completely different story. When properly cut and placed under direct light, it produces a level of brilliance that feels unexpectedly alive. Not soft, not subtle, but sharp, almost electric. Its dispersion sends flashes of spectral color outward in a way that can rival stones many times its price. The effect isn't just sparkle, it's motion. What's changing in 2026 isn't the stone itself. It's the moment people finally encounter it without the filter of outdated perception. Across the U.S., more buyers are stepping outside traditional retail narratives, exploring independent jewelers, specialized collections, and direct visual comparisons. And in those environments, blue zircon begins to reveal something difficult to ignore. It was never lacking in quality. It was lacking in recognition. That realization tends to happen quickly. One side-by-side comparison is often enough. A stone once assumed to be secondary suddenly competes on visual performance alone and holds its ground. Not because of branding, but because of physics. High refractive index, strong dispersion, light behavior that doesn't need explanation once it's seen, and once that shift occurs, it doesn't reverse easily. There's also a deeper appeal tied to rediscovery. In a market where many buyers feel they've already seen the main stones, finding something that contradicts expectation carries a different kind of value. It creates a sense of correction, of finally understanding something that had been misunderstood for years. Blue zircon benefits directly from that correction. It doesn't need to be rebranded. It doesn't need a new category. It only needs to be seen clearly without comparison to anything else that shares part of its name. That clarity is spreading, and as more buyers encounter it on its own terms, the narrative surrounding it is beginning to shift, away from imitation and towards something far more difficult to overlook. Because once a misconception breaks, it rarely returns in the same form. Ranked 7th, Tanzanite. Some gemstones carry an invisible deadline. Tanzanite is one of them. It exists within a remarkably confined geological pocket in the Miralani Hills of northern Tanzania, an area so specific that attempts to locate comparable deposits elsewhere have repeatedly failed. This isn't a matter of branding or controlled distribution. It's a matter of formation conditions that so far appear singular. That reality has been known for decades. What's changing in 2026 is how seriously it's being taken. Across the U.S., conversations around Tanzanite are shifting from admiration to timing. The question is no longer whether the stone is beautiful, it's whether access to it will remain consistent within a single generation. Estimates about remaining supply vary, but the perception of limitation has reached a point where it influences behavior directly. And perception in this case is enough. Retail patterns reflect that pressure. Stones that once lingered in display cases are moving with more urgency. Buyers who previously delayed decisions are returning sooner, often after realizing that replacement is not guaranteed. The idea of waiting for a better one becomes less stable when the pool itself may be narrowing. Tanzanite's visual identity reinforces this dynamic. Its signature blue-to-violet shift, driven by pleochroism, creates a sense of depth that changes depending on angle and lighting. It doesn't present a single fixed color. It reveals multiple layers, and that variability makes each piece feel less interchangeable. In a market increasingly drawn to individuality, that distinction matters. But it's the timeline attached to it that elevates demand. There is also a broader psychological factor at play. American buyers in 2026 are showing a stronger response to assets perceived as finite within a known window. Not abstract rarity, but tangible limitation tied to a real location and a plausible endpoint. Tanzanite fits that framework with unusual precision. It doesn't require speculation to feel scarce. It already is, geographically, geologically, and increasingly in circulation. As that awareness spreads, hesitation begins to look different. Delaying a purchase is no longer just a matter of preference. It becomes a calculation against an uncertain future supply. And in that environment, interest doesn't rise gradually. It compresses. Ranked 6th, Sphene. Under controlled lighting, most gemstones reveal their strengths gradually. This one doesn't wait. Sphene, also known as titanite, reacts to light with an intensity that feels almost excessive. Instead of a measured sparkle, it produces sharp, fragmented bursts of color that scatter across the surface in rapid flashes. Green, yellow, orange, sometimes all within a single movement. The effect is not subtle, and it isn't designed to be. It's immediate. That immediacy is exactly what aligns with a growing shift in American buying behavior. In an environment where attention is increasingly visual and often decided within seconds, stones that require explanation are losing ground. Sphene operates in the opposite direction. It doesn't need context. It delivers impact on first exposure. What sets it apart is not just brightness, but dispersion, the ability to split light into spectral colors. In Sphene, this effect can exceed what many buyers associate with traditional high-performance gems. The result is a visual experience that feels dynamic, almost unstable, as if the stone is constantly on the edge of changing. That unpredictability plays directly into its appeal. Collectors who have spent years with more controlled optical profiles are responding to something different here: variation. No two viewing angles feel identical. No two lighting conditions produce the same response. It creates a sense that the stone is not fixed, but active, engaging with its environment rather than simply reflecting it. There is, however, a trade-off. Sphene is relatively soft compared to many mainstream gemstones. It demands more careful handling, more intentional setting choices, and a different kind of ownership mindset. For a long time, that limitation restricted its visibility in the broader market. In 2026, that barrier is weakening. Buyers are becoming more selective about when and how they wear certain pieces. Not every gemstone is expected to function as an all-purpose accessory. Some are chosen specifically for moments, settings where their strengths can be fully experienced. Within that context, Sphene's fragility becomes less of a drawback and more of a condition that frames its use. And when it is used in the right environment, its effect is difficult to replace. It doesn't compete by refinement. It competes by intensity, and intensity, once experienced directly, tends to reset expectations. Ranked 5th, Ethiopian opal. Everything up to this point follows a pattern: color intensity, optical performance, or perceived limitation. Then this stone enters the conversation, and the pattern collapses. Ethiopian opal behaves in ways that challenge nearly every traditional expectation placed on a gemstone. Its internal structure allows it to absorb moisture, sometimes altering its appearance temporarily. Under certain conditions, its play of color can soften, blur, or even seem to disappear before returning again. Stability, in the conventional sense, is not guaranteed, and yet demand continues to rise. This contradiction sits at the center of its growing presence in the American market in 2026. In a category where predictability has long been associated with value, Ethiopian opal introduces variability, and rather than resisting it, buyers are leaning in. Part of that shift comes from a broader change in how uniqueness is defined. A gemstone that behaves identically in all conditions is easier to categorize, easier to grade, and easier to compare. But it is also easier to replace. Ethiopian opal resists that framework. Its appearance is not fixed. It evolves depending on environment, light, and handling. That variability creates a different kind of relationship between the stone and its owner. Instead of a static object, it becomes something more responsive. Not in a mechanical sense, but in a perceptual one. Each viewing can reveal a different configuration of color, flashes of red, green, blue that shift unpredictably across the surface. No two moments are perfectly identical, and that lack of repetition becomes part of its identity. There is also a generational component influencing its rise. American buyers are increasingly comfortable with materials that require understanding rather than assumption. Information about care, storage, and environmental sensitivity is more accessible than ever, reducing the uncertainty that once limited broader adoption. In that context, Ethiopian opal is no longer seen as unstable. It is seen as nuanced. Retail trends reflect this reframing. Stones that would have been considered too inconsistent for mainstream appeal are now positioned as distinctive, even expressive. The variability that once raised questions is now part of the story being sold, and more importantly, the story being accepted. This is where the market begins to shift away from strict logic, because value is no longer tied exclusively to permanence or predictability. It is increasingly tied to experience, how a gemstone behaves, how it changes, and how it feels to own something that doesn't conform to a fixed state. Ethiopian opal doesn't fit the old model, and that is precisely why it fits the current one. Ranked fourth. Spinel. Misidentification has shaped the reputation of certain gemstones for centuries. In few cases has that legacy been as persistent or as limiting as it has been for Spinel. Historically, Spinel occupied a borrowed identity. Red varieties were often mistaken for ruby, blue tones confused with sapphire, and in many collections it was cataloged under names that were never truly its own. The visual similarity was convincing enough to sustain the confusion, and for a long time that confusion defined its place in the market. What has changed in 2026 is not the stone itself, but the clarity surrounding it. Advancements in gemological testing have long separated Spinel from the stones it was once associated with, but only recently has that distinction translated into widespread recognition. In the United States, awareness is catching up with reality, and with it, a shift in perception is taking hold. Spinel is no longer viewed as an alternative, it is being chosen directly. Part of this transition is driven by color. Certain Spinel varieties, particularly cobalt blue and vivid pink, exhibit a level of saturation that feels unusually precise. The tones are clean, often free from the inclusions that complicate other gemstones, and they present with a brightness that reads clearly even under varied lighting conditions. But color alone doesn't explain the shift. There is a growing preference among American buyers for stones that carry a sense of independence. Materials that do not rely on comparison to justify their appeal. Spinel aligns with that preference in a way that few gemstones can. Its history of misidentification, once a disadvantage, now reinforces its narrative. A stone that existed in plain sight, overlooked not because it lacked value, but because it was never fully recognized. That narrative resonates. Ownership becomes less about acquiring something familiar and more about selecting something that has been redefined. In a market increasingly shaped by personal discovery, this distinction matters. It introduces a sense of intentionality that traditional categories don't always provide. Retail behavior reflects the shift. Pieces featuring Spinel are no longer framed as substitutes. They are presented as focal points, often highlighted for their color alone rather than their proximity to other stones. Buyers respond accordingly, not by comparing, but by selecting. This marks a turning point in how the stone is positioned. No longer confined to borrowed identities, Spinel now operates under its own name, its own characteristics, and its own demand curve. And once a gemstone transitions from comparison to recognition, it rarely returns to the margins. Ranked third. Alexandrite. Certain gemstones reveal everything at a glance. Others hold back until the environment changes. Alexandrite belongs to the latter. In daylight, it presents as a composed green, often with a slightly bluish undertone that appears stable and controlled. Under warmer incandescent light, that same stone shifts, sometimes dramatically, into red or purplish red. The transformation is not a surface effect or a trick of cutting. It is embedded within the crystal structure itself, driven by the way it selectively absorbs and reflects different wavelengths of light. This duality is what defines its value. Unlike gemstones judged by a single, consistent appearance, Alexandrite introduces variability as a core feature. Its identity is not fixed. It depends on context, lighting conditions, viewing environment, even time of day. That dependence creates a form of engagement that extends beyond visual appreciation. It requires interaction. In 2026, this quality aligns closely with changing preferences among American buyers. There is a growing interest in objects that respond, that evolve, that offer more than one interpretation. Static perfection is becoming less compelling when compared to materials that demonstrate change. Alexandrite doesn't compete on color alone. It competes on experience. Ownership involves more than selecting a shade or evaluating clarity. It involves observing how the stone behaves across different settings, noticing the transition, anticipating the shift. The value becomes tied to that sequence rather than a single moment. There is also a rarity factor attached to this behavior. While many gemstones exhibit some degree of optical phenomenon, few do so with the consistency and contrast seen in fine Alexandrite. The strength of the color change, how distinct the green to red transition appears, directly influences desirability, creating a hierarchy based not just on appearance, but on performance. That performance-based evaluation introduces a different kind of comparison within the market. Instead of asking which stone looks better under one condition, the question becomes more complex. How convincingly does it transform? How complete is the shift? How distinct are the two identities it presents? These are not passive considerations. They draw attention, encourage repeated viewing, and extend the time spent with the stone, factors that increasingly influence buying decisions. As interest in responsive, behavior-driven materials continues to grow, Alexandrite occupies a position that is difficult to replicate. It does not rely on saturation, size, or even origin alone. It relies on change, and in a market that is beginning to favor interaction over constancy, that change carries weight. Ranked second. Paraiba tourmaline. Exposure changes expectations. For those encountering Paraiba tourmaline under proper lighting for the first time, the shift can be immediate and difficult to reverse. The color does not behave like conventional blue. It carries an intensity that appears internally lit, as though the stone is generating its own glow rather than reflecting what surrounds it. That effect originates from trace amounts of copper within the crystal structure, altering the way light is transmitted and perceived. The result is a neon-like saturation that feels closer to an electronic display than a natural mineral. It is not subtle, and it is not easily compared. This is where the psychological response begins. Once that level of color intensity is registered, other blue gemstones often feel comparatively restrained, not lacking in quality but operating within a narrower visual range. Paraiba recalibrates the scale. It introduces a new reference point, one that shifts perception rather than fitting into it. In the American market of 2026, this recalibration is driving a specific kind of demand. Buyers are not simply selecting Paraiba as an option among many. They are returning to it after seeing it once, measuring other stones against the memory it creates. That memory is persistent. Retail observations indicate a pattern. Initial exposure leads to comparison. Comparison leads to dissatisfaction with alternatives, and dissatisfaction leads back to the original source. The process does not always happen immediately, but it tends to follow a recognizable trajectory. Scarcity reinforces this cycle. High-quality Paraiba tourmaline, particularly stones with strong neon saturation, remains limited in availability regardless of origin. Brazilian material carries historical weight, while African sources have expanded supply but not diminished demand. The defining characteristic remains the same: intensity that is difficult to replicate consistently. This combination of visual impact and constrained supply amplifies attachment. Ownership is not framed purely in terms of acquisition. It becomes a resolution to a search that other stones fail to complete. The decision is less about preference and more about alignment with a specific visual standard that has already been set. Within this context, Paraiba does not compete across categories. It narrows them. And once that narrowing occurs, the range of acceptable alternatives tends to contract along with it. In first place, black opal. No standardized scale fully accounts for what this stone does to perception. Black opal resists uniformity at nearly every level. Its dark body tone absorbs ambient light, creating a background that allows internal color to appear suspended. Reds, greens, blues, emerging in shifting patterns that seem detached from the surface itself. The visual effect is not simply contrast. It is depth layered over unpredictability. Each specimen presents a configuration that cannot be precisely replicated. Pattern, brightness, color distribution. These elements vary from stone to stone in ways that resist strict comparison. Two pieces may share similar size and origin yet diverge entirely in visual character. This lack of repeatability introduces a different framework for evaluation, one that relies less on standardized grading and more on individual response. In the United States market in 2026, that framework is gaining influence. Buyers are increasingly moving away from metrics that promise consistency across large categories. Instead, attention is shifting toward materials that offer singularity, objects that are unlikely to be encountered again in the same form. Black opal aligns directly with that preference. Its value is not anchored to uniform benchmarks, but to the improbability of duplication. That distinction alters decision-making. When comparison becomes difficult, hesitation loses its usual structure. There is no clear substitute, no equivalent piece waiting elsewhere. The question is no longer whether a better option exists, but whether this specific configuration will ever appear again. This introduces a sense of immediacy that differs from conventional scarcity. It is not driven solely by limited supply, but by non-repeatable outcomes within that supply. Even within the same region, most notably Lightning Ridge in Australia, the variability remains high. Each stone reflects a unique arrangement of silica spheres, forming patterns that range from broad flashes to fine pinfire, none of which follow a predictable template. As awareness of this variability expands, so does its impact on perception. Black opal is not evaluated as one category among many. It operates as a collection of singular events, each requiring independent consideration. That shift redefines what buyers look for. Not perfection within a system, but distinction outside of it. In this environment, the concept of the best becomes less stable. What replaces it is something more immediate, more subjective, and more difficult to standardize: the recognition of something that will not repeat. Black opal does not adjust to existing expectations. It alters them. Value is no longer defined the way it used to be. Not by clarity, not by tradition, but by what stays in memory after everything else fades. Some of these stones stand out because they were overlooked, some because they behave differently, and some because, once seen, they're almost impossible to replace. But that shift raises a more difficult question. When everything starts to look more convincing, how much of it is actually real? That's where the next part begins.